And we are at part 6. It's the Psych 400 course pack, chapter 16, SEM1, path analysis with manifest variables. We're up to part 6 of my video series on this chapter 16. We are at page 31, toward the bottom of page 31. We're still talking about the various statistics that can be computed from a path analysis. And finally, we're getting to some of the statistics that would be of particular interest, the kind of statistics that you're actually interested in before you began the analysis, but you had to get through all the other statistics in order to get to these, the ones that are maybe of central purpose, central interest. And these are the statistics that reflect the size of direct effects, indirect effects, and total effects. Let's see, I've added some red font to the bottom of this paragraph. I typed in blanks on pages 31 through 34 are already filled in, but I'll lecture on them anyway because students will need this information for a discussion exercise. I do plan to assign a discussion exercise in one way or another. The next few pages, the blanks are already filled in, so technically you have the information. But I wanted to go over it in this video just so that you heard me talking about it, and I think that'll make the information a little bit easier to understand and help it stick a little bit better. Let's go to page 32. We have a table that's headed Path Analysis Results, Direct Effects, Indirect Effects, and Total Effects of antecedent variables on endogenous variables for Model 3. Now remember, Model 3 is our model. Model 3 is the final preferred model that was best supported by the various statistical analyses that we performed. We have 3 groups of columns of statistics. This group of columns is headed exercise sessions. Remember, that's the most important outcome variable that we cared about. The ultimate outcome variable that Dr. O'Day wanted to predict was how many exercise sessions a given person would engage in a typical week. Under the heading exercise sessions, we have one column of statistics headed direct. These coefficients represent the direct effects of antecedent variables on exercise sessions. For example, health motivation has a statistic of 0.17. That means that the direct effect of health motivation on exercise sessions was 0.17. That was the size of the path coefficient that we saw in the figure that I presented in the previous video. For dislike of exercise, the statistic is negative 0.19. So dislike of exercise has a direct effect of negative 0.19 on exercise sessions. I presented that statistic in the previous video. Lack of time for exercise was our big predictor variable. It had a big direct effect of negative 0.36 on exercise sessions. But those are just the direct effects. There's other kinds of effects that I haven't really talked about so far in this video series. What about indirect effects? Yes, antecedent variables might have indirect effects on exercise sessions. The indirect effect of dislike of exercise on exercise sessions is negative 0.04. What could that possibly mean? And then finally, there's a column headed total. These are the total effects. What's the total effect of health motivation on exercise sessions? Total effect is 0.17. What's the total effect of dislike of exercise on exercise sessions? It's negative 0.22. Where do these statistics come from? We'll see them in a second. The last 2 groups of columns are the same kind of statistics, but for our 2 other endogenous variables. Health motivation, when we look at the variables that have direct effects or indirect effects on health motivation, the statistics that represent the size of those effects are represented here. Dislike of exercise, think about the direct effects and indirect effects that different variables might have on dislike of exercise. Size of those effects are reflected by the size of the statistics here. Let's go to the text. We are on page 32 and the text. First up, direct effects. As we explained above, a direct effect, symbol DE, of an antecedent variable on a consequent variable is that part of the effect that's not mediated by another variable. The numbers on the straight single-headed arrows in figure 16.5 are standardized path coefficients, and these path coefficients may also be interpreted as direct effects. They're listed in table 16.5 under the heading direct. I referred to this a second ago. Table 16.5 under the heading direct. Direct effect of health motivation on exercise sessions is 0.17 and so forth. We saw these statistics before, just to connect them to the figure that we looked at before. This was the final preferred path model. The direct effect of health motivation on exercise sessions was positive 0.17, exactly the same statistic that we just looked at in that figure. So, or in that table. Let's go back to that table that presents direct effects, indirect effects, and so forth. Okay, so direct effects, I'm on page 32. Direct effects, basically represented by those path coefficients that we've referred to in several previous videos. Let's go to a new concept on page 32. Toward the bottom of 32, a new concept, the concept of indirect effects. In contrast to a direct effect, an indirect effect, symbol IE, one variable and a second variable represents that part of the effect that's transmitted by one or more other mediating variables in the model. Let's say that again. An indirect effect, I think I'm missing the word of, an indirect effect of one variable on a second variable represents that part of the effect that's transmitted by one or more other mediating variables in the model. A mediating variable is a variable that intervenes between the antecedent variable and the consequent variable and transmits the effect from the antecedent to the consequence. It says see figure 16.5. Okay, then we need to, well, actually, let's read a little bit further before we go back to figure 16.5. Let's go to page 33, where I put into words what I'm about to refer to in a figure. On page 33, we have this. For example, figure 16.5 shows that lack of time for exercise has two indirect effects on exercise sessions. First up, with one indirect effect, lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise, which in turn has a negative effect on exercise sessions. And I've added in red font here, see the new figure that I added on page 38. I thought this might be a little bit difficult to understand if you didn't have an additional visual aid. So I took that figure, 16.5, which we've already looked at before, I duplicated it and I've added it as sort of the last page of this chapter on page 38. And it will illustrate an indirect effect. For example, with one indirect effect, lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise, which then has a negative effect on exercise sessions. What is he talking about? Let's go to page 38. Yes. Now, this was not in the version of the course pack that you bought at the bookstore at the beginning of the semester. I have added it to this document as page 38. What does it say? Below is an extra copy of figure 16.5, which originally appeared on page 29. In this chapter, the section on indirect effects, which is where we are right now, discuss two different indirect effects that lack of time for exercise has on exercise sessions. Below, I've added yellow and green lines to illustrate these two different indirect effects specifically. The yellow line illustrates the indirect effect in which lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise, which then has a negative effect on exercise sessions. Look only for the yellow line in the figure. Here's an indirect effect that lack of time for exercise is going to have on exercise sessions. Lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise, and it makes sense. The more you complain you don't have time for exercise, the more likely you're to complain that you hate exercise. Dislike of exercise then has a negative effect on exercise sessions. That makes sense. The more you complain, I hate to exercise, the fewer exercise sessions you're going to engage in. So this is an indirect effect. Indirect effect that begins at lack of time for exercise, is transmitted to dislike of exercise, and then ends up at exercise sessions. So this yellow line represents one indirect effect. But what's this green line all about? Well, I explained that above. The green line illustrates the indirect effect in which lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise, which then has a negative effect on health motivation, which then has a positive effect on exercise sessions. Yes, it's possible for an antecedent variable to have more than one indirect effect on a consequent variable. This time let's focus only on the green line. This is another indirect effect of lack of time for exercise on exercise sessions. It goes like this. Lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise. Dislike of exercise then has a negative effect on health motivation. Health motivation then has a positive effect on exercise sessions. That is a different indirect effect. So, lack of time for exercise has two indirect effects on exercise sessions. One represented by this yellow line, one represented by the green line, two different indirect effects. Let's go back where we had left off, which I believe, yes, was on page 33. I had left off on page 33. I had read this paragraph. The second paragraph refers to the second indirect effect. With the second indirect effect, lack of time for exercise has a positive effect on dislike of exercise, which in turn has a negative effect on health motivation, which in turn has a positive effect on exercise sessions. So there can be more than one indirect effect that an antecedent variable has a consequent variable. Finally, we come to the statistic that might be the single most important statistic to the researcher. The statistic that you really had in mind when you began this research project. That statistic is the statistic that represents total effects. Finally, the statistic that may be of greatest interest in table 16.5 are total effects, sometimes called effect coefficient, symbol EC. Total effect of an antecedent variable and a consequent variable refers to the sum of the direct effects plus its indirect effects on the consequent variable. For example, table 16.5 shows the direct effect of lack of time for exercise on exercise sessions is negative 0.36. The indirect effect of lack of time for exercise on exercise sessions was negative 0.08. Therefore, the total effect of lack of time for exercise on exercise sessions was equal to the sum of those two statistics. Negative 0.36 plus negative 0.08 is equal to negative 0.44. The fact that the total effect statistic negative 0.43 that's reported in the table is not exactly equal to the sum that I just computed, the negative 0.44, is merely due to rounding error. Researchers often review total effects from the path analysis in order to identify antecedent variables that may be the most important overall determinants of the consequent variables. This is one of the ways path coefficient or path analysis is superior to multiple regression. Multiple regression is only capable of identifying variables with the most important direct effects on a criterion variable. That is, if we think of the relationships studied in multiple regression as being causal relationships. However, path analysis allows the computation of total effects, which reflects direct as well as indirect effects. And just in case you forgot from the previous video lecture, yes, total effects are presented in table 16.5. This column represents the size of the total effects of our antecedent variables on exercise sessions. Here we have total effects of antecedent variables on health motivation, and here we have total effects of antecedent variables on dislike of exercise. We get to the end of our chapter. I am on page 34. Summary of findings. Of the three theoretical path models investigated, Model 3 displayed the best overall fit to the data, a fit that was significantly better than the fit displayed by Model 1 or Model 2. For Model 3, The signs of the standardized path coefficients, as presented in Figure 16.5, were consistent with those initially proposed by Dr. O'Day. Each path coefficient was non-trivial in size, according to the criteria provided by Billings and Roten. For various relationships between variables, total effect coefficients range from 0.04 to negative 0.43. Stop lecturing here. Let's just take one last look at the final preferred causal model, going way back to page 29. Page 29 in Figure 16.5. If you look at all of the arrows, whether solid or dashed or dotted, if you look at all of the arrows together, they constitute Model 3. The final preferred model thing that Dr. O'Day was trying to identify was the variables that have causal effects on exercise sessions. She's identified that, and she's also identified those variables that have indirect effects on exercise sessions. This is her final theoretical model that describes the determinants of exercise sessions. Now, this is the end of part 6 of my video series, but there's going to be a part 7. Part 7 will say a few things about discussion exercise that I normally use in conjunction with chapter 16. So look for the video, part 7.